And if that worked, then, oops, I have to click it twice apparently. It says you aren't scheduled to noon. It says it's live. If that worked, you should see a purple page that says speed running the next decade in banking somewhere. Oh, it shows? Okay. And that, how did you get there? Use the event link? Ah, okay. Okay. Because that was the other thing I wasn't clear about. Because when you go to StreamYard, you just connect your LinkedIn account, right? So somehow from there, then it knows to go to the link back to the page, right? To the event page. Yeah, it's weird, right? Because you would expect that you just plug in the actual event link into StreamYard. So otherwise, oh wow, well that's a relief. Let me unmute myself and do an audio test. Testing the audio for the event. I'll take it. That's not working. Okay. Oh, okay. So there's an enormous delay then. I mean, that was what? Like a minute delay? Okay. All right. Well, I muted myself on StreamYard again. Mm, so now, hmm. Okay. Let me check on that and see if there's something I can do about this on my. Who can hear me? Oh, oh, I don't know who that is. Main mic. One. Huh. Where is it picking it up from? It's very unclear to me here. Settings. Audio. Chris, my. Oh, maybe change that. Okay. Let me do away with the filter and try that again. This is audio test 2 to see if we get better audio quality. How's that? Did you hear anything? Okay. And then I just have to avoid sounding like I'm riding the other bus. Okay. All right. Well, oh, so the other thing that I don't see at all is whether or not people are on. Can you see that on your end at all? Okay, terrific. Yeah, I wish I would be able to somehow make that visible on my end. Yeah, yeah. No, okay. Because when I go to the page I still don't see the live thing at all. Huh. Okay then. Okay. Thank you, my friend. I'll talk to you later. All right. Bye. All right, this is noon. Due to the limitation of the software, I am not entirely sure who is all listening to that, so it's a little bit like talking into a void. But according to my friend Jeff, there's people on the line, so I'm gonna give everybody maybe 3 minutes to decide whether or not to stay and or join. And then I'm literally gonna speed run through the next decade of banking. Feel free to drop questions into the chat, and in as much as I can navigate my three screens here simultaneously without having a video or audio editor on my end, I will try to answer these or otherwise later by email. All right, so it's 4 minutes past noon. I'm gonna start with the presentation, even though that I'm not entirely clear that it's actually streaming, so hope for the best. This is gonna be a speed run through the next decade in banking or in finance more generally speaking. For background, we spent the last 5 years evaluating new financial technologies. We looked at some 2,000 projects with a team of data scientists, financial engineers here, made a dozen investments along the line, and kept a lot of tabs on the development of new financial solutions. We have also a lot to say about central bank digital currencies and related technologies that have an influence on that. So I'm going to be speaking to those topics as well. So first, the usual disclaimer. Of course, this is not financial, accounting, or otherwise professional advice. Please treat crypto, fintech, and anything else, including the banking system, with the precautionary measures of introducing yourself to otherwise qualified individuals before making any decisions to engage them and or invest in any technologies or securities. Where do you see banking in 10 years? That's a question we have internally been pushing around, and we came up with some theories to that, and I will present those forthcoming here. I always like to zoom out quite a bit and basically start with what's this little project of ours here? What do we do? Planet Earth is some 4.5 billion years old and was host to some 4 billion species. 90% of them are extinct today. And as a human species, we're basically a startup ourselves, just about 300,000 years old. And a collaborating factor to that has been the ability to collaborate. And that's what the success of our species is built on. And there's a lot of problems when it comes to collaboration, and one specifically that has to do with the financial space is what we call the coincidence of wants problem. I have something that you want, but don't have the equivalent of what you might want. So you have rice, I have chickens, and we have to evaluate how much chicken is worth a bag of rice or vice versa. And so we introduce solutions that we call currencies, or specifically languages of value. So if you speak dollars and you claim that your bag of rice is worth 10 bucks, and the answer is, well, my chicken is worth 1,360 yen, then we still can't come to an agreement until and when I know how to translate my language of value to your language of value, which is to say that language is really the primary technology for all collaboration. And if you ever want to do a deeper dive on that, there's a very interesting little pamphlet that was written in 1958 called I Pencil. Basically, the idea being as if you by yourself were to develop a pencil, you would spend your entire life trying to source the necessary material and figuring out the technology to develop this particular tool, and ultimately most likely fail in doing so. Which brings us to a more narrow form of collaboration, which is cooperation. The distinction here is based on the fact that collaboration is working towards a mutual goal without an external incentive mechanism, versus cooperation, which is how most societies today function, require an incentive mechanism. And the systems that we are using for that can mostly be described in two ways. We're calling it finance, but what is finance? Finance is built based on two basic principles, which is that of contracts and ledgers, and the combination of the two, keeping ledgers of various contracts and obligations. And to simplify the history of technologies for those two topics, we can look back throughout human history, and you will find a lot of different anecdotes and metaphors and myths around the topic of financial technologies, but really you can break it down in just 4 steps. For 99% of human history, we just remembered our debts. We would hold those memories in our wetware, in our brains. And only some 5,500 years ago, we invented more sophisticated technologies that we called clay tables. Actually, the earliest forms of writing cuneiform were ledgers. And only 100 years after Christ was born, we invented paper solution and started to keep ledgers on paper-based solutions, and then The obvious one, only in the 60s we invented database solutions and we started transferring those contracts and those ledgers into databases and into bytes. Then this is the picture that most people probably have in mind when they think about money, and you'd be wrong to call it that, and we're going to get into this. So this is specifically a form of cash, in this particular case, Federal Reserve notes. Federal Reserve notes are great. It's a peer-to-peer medium of exchange, also in the context of the United States. It happens to be the United States' most profitable export products by revenue. It's only exceeded by refined oil products, and is something that we will never abandon, regardless of any myth-telling in public media. Around the world, 64% of all value is today held in US dollars, as it's the reserve currency of the world. And outside of that, while there are 180 languages of value, so 180 other fiat currencies, there's only 7 that are of some relevance, and you can see those here. It's the euro as a far distant second, and then yen, pound, the Australian dollar, the Canadian dollar, and renminbi. Point there being is that currencies are network technologies, and in as much that they achieve network effect, they're going to be successful or not, or widely used or not. So as a result, whenever another language of value failed throughout history, this particular country would usually import cash, physical US dollar cash, and more than 1.2 trillion of this physical cash resides today outside of the confines of the United States. But cash usage has declined quite a bit. So this indicates the velocity. Velocity simply means it's how many times a note is being exchanged for a good or product or service on the other end, and it indicates a value here by quarter. So on average before COVID, when you see that big decline here, a Federal Reserve note was used 4 times a year to exchange it against goods or services, which basically means it's an entirely useless implementation and entirely useless technology for modern economies. Consequently, it's only used for about 3% of value exchange. Note, this is not the transaction count. These are the transaction amounts, and this pertains to the United States only. So then languages that are being spoken across borders, and languages of value there specifically, is mostly the US dollar. As you can see here, it makes up 96% of all cross-border transactions in the Americas, and overall it equals out to be close to 80%, only Europe being the exception here. This is the global macro picture. This is global GDP in 2021 first quarter, and it stood at $96 trillion. Just to compare the economies here, so you see that US and Europe makes combined about 42%. 24% of that is the United States. Europe is 18%, with the rest being attributed to smaller countries. So what I'd like you to take away from this are the following axioms. The success of our species depends on collaboration. The fundamental technology for collaboration is language. And human societies today focus on incentivized collaboration, which we call cooperation. And our primary incentive technology that we're using for this cooperation, we call currencies. So then, unfortunately, what has happened over the past decade specifically is a distortion of these languages of value, and we call these generally inflation. There's 3 types of inflations. You can break this down further, but this is probably the most useful one. Lynn Alden, if you ever want to read the details on that, wrote a very succinct summary of these. So we have the debasement, so monetary inflation of borrowed currency supply and always underlying currency, and we'll break that down further, but I insist on that. We have a lot of asset price inflation, new money, new currency specifically for the same asset doesn't create more value in the world, it just creates more currency in the world. And then lastly, and that's usually what the Federal Reserve System will talk about, is consumer price inflation with a variation of variables that are made up on the fly. This is a description that the Federal Reserve System provided. You can break this down further of different types of currencies. In the US context, you have three kinds of currencies. According to the Federal Reserve, you have central bank currency, which you can see here makes up 6%, so that is your cash. It's a bearer instrument. You got mostly commercial bank currency, and then you have a group that the Federal Reserve System refers to as non-bank currency, which is really also commercial bank currency, but it's held in accounts of non-banks. Think your PayPals, Zenefits, and otherwise quote-unquote fintech companies of the world. The point of the slide is to show that the vast majority of currency in the current system is actually created by commercial banks. So it's not printed, quote unquote, by the Federal Reserve. That's a little bit of a myth and a misnomer. It's systemically not very relevant. It's a downstream effect of sorts that we will talk about. But I want to emphasize why what the Federal Reserve System issues, which is the only peer-to-peer instrument, is really great because you can transact it anonymously. You don't have to provide your passport. It can be used by people that are otherwise unbanked because they might not have credentials. And typically the fees are negligible, meaning zero. So then in 2009, a white paper was published under the title Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. It's actually not the first instant settlement mechanism. We had instant settlement on telecommunication networks around the world for decades, but it's the first time that the broader public was made aware of that. And it's really, really important to internalize the title of this paper. It's a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And you should think about what that means, but we're going to break it out for you. I came across a quote probably 2-3 years ago from John Oliver that describes pretty succinct to this day the state of the understanding of the broad public of quote-unquote cryptocurrencies, which according to him combine everything no one understands about technology with everything nobody understands about money. And he should have said currency. Here it's not really money. But this goes back to the earliest violations of formal logic. The definition of money used by the Federal Reserve System and public at large goes something like money is a unit of account, a store of value, and a medium of exchange. This goes back to a little pamphlet Mr. Jevons wrote in 1875. It was wrong when he wrote it. It's still wrong today. And I'm going to explain why that is. And it's probably the most important thing to understand if you want to understand currency systems. So the unit of account is the first item here. As you can see, I have a wallet here and it shows my different holdings and it shows them without value, and I can add a value to that and I can see my Bitcoin holdings in US dollar, I can see them in euros, I can see them in yen. Obviously, the value didn't change, only the unit of account changed. So, which means the unit of account from a technology perspective is an interface function. Then how do people store value? This is the example of the United States, and we don't have to have philosophical or ideological discussions about that. We can just observe that stores of value, as considered by the public at large, can be measured in stocks, in bonds, in certificate of deposits and mortgages, and then to a far lesser degree in cash and demand deposit accounts, which we call checking accounts. So by and large, cash is about 1.1% of overall stores of value. So you can just imagine that 99% of cash is not considered a store of value, to simplify this massively. But then also, I put here a little Bitcoin sign. Is actually bigger than it should be, obviously, because Bitcoin has a market cap of, I think, $500 billion at the moment or something in that neighborhood. So it should be a little smaller. But larger point there being is it's really not yet relevant as a store of value. Overarching point, though, is the stores of value are baskets. They are not made up of currencies. If you're using a fiat currency as a store of value alone, you're simply using it wrong. So the last item then that you want to mention is a medium of exchange. Observably, the medium of exchange has been bytes for decades. On the left side, you'll see a dollar expressed in bytes. And on the right side, you see $1 billion worth of Bitcoin. So in today's economy, what we usually do when we transfer value, you are Bob and you want to send some currency to Alice. What do? Well, you call up your bank, you send a message, and or otherwise use an interface function that is also a message. And you instruct your bank to update your ledger to the benefit of Alice's ledger, and those two intermediaries then exchange messages, usually using another 2.5 intermediaries to facilitate this messaging system. Larger point there being, these are messaging systems, even though they are called payment system. Settlement will either never occur or occur in some time based on whatever account agreements exist, based on whatever account function you are using. So what's my point? The point being here is that the earlier definition that I introduced, that Jevons wrote in 1875, includes a logical fallacy, a formal logical fallacy indeed, which is a conflation, and it's specifically the conflation of use cases and functions. And what I'll typically offer for that, to make this easier to understand, is if you use the technology of a hammer as an example, then the function of a hammer is always exactly the same. It's to centralize centrifugal force. And then one use case might be to put a nail in the wall. Another use case might be to harm another person. However, it will never change the function. So if you're using a currency as a store of value, well, then that's just one use case. If you're using more than a few percentage points of a fiat currency as a store of value, you're simply using that technology wrong. So moving on to blockchains, unfortunately, reality doesn't have an advertising budget. So everything that you're reading online about this technological paradigm is some form of motivated reasoning, advertising copy, or otherwise just a misunderstanding of how these technologies actually work. Blockchains are not ledgers. You're not supposed to record anything in a blockchain-based solution. Blockchains are most certainly not ledgers. Blockchains are most certainly not databases specifically. DLTs are the opposite of blockchains. The singular function that you should deploy from a blockchain-based solution is that of changing control over a set of bytes from one address to another. If you use it in any other way, you're most likely invalidating the herd immunity of your application, meaning you won't be able to comply with certain laws and regulations anymore, i.e. when you create an immutable record from a personal identifiable data byte. So this is going to be my Mickey Mouse explanation of how peer-to-peer solutions work, or public key cryptography in particular. We got our Bob here again, and he wants to send value to Alice. So he puts value into a box, puts his log on, sends that to Alice. Now Alice has a pretty useless box because she doesn't have the key for the log attached to that box. So what does she do? She attaches her own log to that box, and now there's two logs on that box, and she sends it back to Bob, and then Bob takes off his log, sends it back to Alice, and now Alice has a box with whatever value or information this box contains in her possession and the keys to that box. And again, this is the kindergarten version of how peer-to-peer value exchange works, specifically using public key cryptography. Then there's a lot of vacuous debates on whether or not to value certain quote-unquote transactions using blockchain-based solutions. And I say quote-unquote because it is utterly false to call any control changes over bytes a transaction, because there is no way of knowing that unless you have access to the controllers of both of these addresses. So this is a very simple example from Etherscan that I just randomly grabbed, and these are the information that you can read. And obviously these are further obfuscated depending on what second layer solution you might use. Point there being is you have no way of knowing whether or not this was a transaction, and you can divvy up transactions pretty simply. We're going to do this in the next slide. So any attempt to put a label on this transaction is not dissimilar to putting the label murder weapon on your hammer without actually knowing what has happened here. The only thing that you do know is that control over a certain amount of ether was changed from one address to another. As far as we know, this address was controlled by the exact same person, but we don't know whether or not to qualify this transaction in any of those four buckets. And in principle, only these four buckets from a commercial perspective exist. I'll send you a form of value in exchange for a product or service. I don't expect the currency back that I'm sending to you. I expect a product from you or a service from you. We call that usually a payment. Or I'll send it to you, I want it back later. Then we call that a loan. I'll send it to you, I don't want anything in return. We call that a donation. And then we have this kind of niche case where I'll send it to you. We want to create something together for a shared interest, and we call that an equity. So whenever a regulator is trying to attempt to make the distinction between those four quote-unquote transactions without querying both controllers of those addresses, it's akin to the attempt of deciding whether or not bytes are red, green, or blue. It's an entirely void, vacuous exercise. No one should ever claim that every token is a security, or every token is a currency, or every token is anything, because tokens are simply standardized smart contracts which you can exchange using a blockchain-based solution, meaning changing control over that address, and that is all that you can know. Moving on to capital formation, a very important part of cooperation in current economies. And the legacy form of capital formation is your typical corporation, your company. Companies suffer from inherent conflicts of interest. Operators typically want different things than employees or clients or suppliers or shareholders, and are pulling in very different directions. Government have their own ideas how companies should function within their realm of influence, and hence it's not the most effective way to organize collaboration, but it's the most efficient way we developed thus far, until the Bitcoin white paper introduced the concept of the decentralized autonomous organization. Is probably the most important invention that was introduced by the Bitcoin white paper. Again, the Bitcoin white paper actually did not introduce blockchain-based solutions. That was actually indirectly referenced in the second footnote. It introduced a different principle. It also didn't solve for the Byzantines' general problem. That was actually solved by the gentleman who invented the term. So what's great about a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization, it aligns the interest of the stakeholders. They might be investors, they might be users, they might be operators, but they are generally speaking moving in the same direction. You have to acquire the incentive mechanism of the blockchain-based solutions. And as a side note, Bitcoin as a metaphorical example only has a mining reward. So what I mean by that is there is no minting function. So in terms of referring to Bitcoin lowercase b being the difference between Bitcoin uppercase b referring to the network, there is actually no new unit of account per se. If you simply look at CoinMarketCap or any of the other exchanges, you will readily notice that the unit of account on the Bitcoin network by and large is the US dollar. So again, it's a confusion here of observable reality and what people wish to be true. But to apply these examples, and all of these numbers will generally refer to the fourth quarter of 2021. You have the legacy capital formation system in form of a corporation such as JP Chase versus the collaboration on a network such as Bitcoin. And you can see how many people it might take to maintain the functions of that particular network. So JP Chase employs 250,000 people, and Bitcoin core developers are currently around 10. Over the lifetime of Bitcoin, there were like 750 people contributing to this open source software system, however, but this is kind of an average number. Then you can see that the transaction volume is much larger on the Bitcoin network, revenue is much larger. But then as a side note as well, these 250,000 people probably turn on their car and their computer in the morning, and it would be a very interesting exercise to do a calculation of how much carbon is being emitted by a single commercial bank in comparison to a global value exchange network such as Bitcoin. And I think the leader would come out pretty favorable compared to the former. Then unfortunately, there was a community situated north of here who invented a term called fintech to use it as window dressing to solutions which obfuscate legacy financial systems. So fintech is a window dressing term in the past applied to companies such as PayPal and other, but have very little to do with core fundamental technology paradigm shifts, but have everything to do with abstracting the fact that you are indeed still using the legacy financial system and you just introduced a new middleman that makes it prettier. But here also the comparison, and I will readily admit all of these comparisons will always be apples to oranges to some extent, quite obviously, but they are directionally correct, and that's the point. So you see that PayPal at that point in time had some 26,000 employees. I'll spare you going through all these numbers because you can probably read. Larger point there being, though, before the invention of decentralized software solutions, blockchains being the prominent example, but there are many others, not many, but some others that we should talk about. Fintech wasn't really a thing in my mind. Fintech was created through the development of decentralized software solutions such as Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other blockchains, as it actually allowed the disruption of the legacy ledger-based system. A quick note to trying to classify tokens. It's largely an exercise in futility. Every token is simply a standardized smart contract, and its utility and its use cases flow from its function. So what do I mean by that? As I mentioned earlier, the singular function of a blockchain is to exchange control over a set of bytes from one address to another. the standardization of this particular exchange is expressed using a standardized smart contract, meaning a token or a coin. There's a difference between a token and a coin, and you were able to, in the past, filter your recording devices such as CoinMarketCap and so forth. For that, quality coin is the native reward mechanism of a public chain. A token is somewhat akin to an API function that interacts with a public chain. So you could, generally speaking, apply these characterizations to this instrument. It might be a commodity, it might be a network function, it might be quote-unquote a stable coin, it might be a governance thing. Ultimately, the easiest thing to do is just simply to observe its function and then measure its use cases and then actually assign the correct value to that. We'll make some examples forthcoming. So in terms of blockchain adoption, you want to ask yourself always these 4 questions at a minimum, rather than leaving it there. And that's emails that I've been getting on a daily basis for the past decade: blockchain adoption, cryptocurrency adoption. And my immediate response is always, well, who is adopting it? Why are they adopting it? When are they adopting it? And most importantly, how are people and users adopting it? So we invented a term called cryptocurrencies. As I mentioned, that's a self-inflicted wound, unfortunately, because it's a technology, again, that allows to exchange control over a set of bytes from A to B. Whether or not that is a form of money is always in question. Usually it's actually not, and it's downstream from its function. And to make this more tangible, if I hand over a Federal Reserve note to you, so the standard physical bearer instrument that people are familiar with, I do not have any abilities to judge whether or not you're using this cash in a form that would allow you to store value over any given period of time, or you turn around and immediately exchange it against something that you consider a store of value, or you might want to set it off on fire or make art with that. That is outside of the typical agreement we call money. And so to put a bow on that, money is a legal agreement over a unit of account and a medium of exchange. And the definition ends here. There's no ability through this legal agreement, generally speaking, to judge whether or not it's considered a store of value. That's entirely subjective. And if you find yourself incarcerated, you might quickly find out that stores of value and unit of accounts are actually cigarette butts or pouches of mackerels, or there might be poker chips. So then today we have about $1 trillion worth of quote-unquote market cap of, again, digital asset, cryptocurrencies. All of these terms are of very little help in order to actually judge the functions and or use cases of these technologies. They're obfuscating it for the most part. But generally speaking, you can see that half of the market cap is made up of Bitcoin. And there we're going to break down what are the actual use cases in the next slide. Then another big chunk here is Ether, and Ether, like all public blockchains, is an open source project with an ever-changing imprint on current network technology, i.e. the initial function of Ether. And you cannot buy Ethereum, you can only buy Ether. If you bought Ethereum, it was gone. That was very sad. You can do that. You can buy Ether, but Ether's intention in the original white paper was to function as a DDoS protection mechanism of this world computer that Vitalik and others were trying to build. And then obviously we have yet more unhelpful narratives today calling this mining reward something like super sound money. Again, it's entirely vacuous. You have no idea whether or not people are treating it as money. They may or may not. For the most part, they don't. You got things that we call stable coins. For the most part, these are US dollar packs. We'll go into that. You got networks token, you got memes tokens, and then you got a few thousand tokens that were created for fun on various purposes, but by and large, we can ignore those. Then there is, again, very little value in discussing what is the use case of Bitcoin, since you can simply read it from the actual blockchain, which is mostly a use case of speculation. The turnovers from BTC on a daily basis has on average been 7.5%, which means the entire market cap of BTC, lowercase b Bitcoin, turns over in about 2 weeks. As a frame of reference, an Apple stock will turn over in about 4 weeks. So same purposes here. It's speculation, is taking advantage of inefficiencies in the system. Then there is a growing amount of individuals that treat it as a store of value, as determined by these values having not been moved for a period of time. I think we decided to take 18 to 24 months in this case, and you can see very interesting graphics on how long individuals are holding these. And then there's a tiny sliver, and I actually made it bigger here than it actually is, of less than 5%, way less than 5% of people that inadvertently or misguidedly are using the mainnet for transactions or payments. As you probably know if you're listening to that, this makes only sense if the transaction costs don't exceed the actual value being moved or approaches the value being moved, which is rarely the case if you're transacting $10 or less. So then, as I promised, here's a slide that shows the use case of Tether, the largest pegged coin by market cap. And again, it's not as the use case of payments, like people like to make a case for and claim that this might infringe of the utility of the US dollar, because Tether is being used on mostly centralized exchanges to exchange it against Bitcoin, Ether, and otherwise digitally native assets. And it solves a particular problem, which is the problem of not moving into a fiat currency and incurring the penalties, meaning the fees attached to that, but rather than incurring that, using a digitally native instrument, and not for the case of payment. Then another popular implementation, and now we are getting into actual fintech territory, which we have been calling decentralized finance for some time. We can measure the current use case of decentralized finance, and we should point out that all of these values here are in billions and have not necessarily been increasing. It's mostly decentralized exchange usage. It's some form of lending, some bridges, collateralized debt protocols, which we're going to explain in the later slides, liquid staking, algo, stablecoins, service yield. There's many other use cases, but these are the 10 or so ones that are actually of some form of relevance, meaning they have more than $1 billion in aggregate interacting with a blockchain-based solution, which I would consider to be the actual fintech of our time. And then you can compare these numbers, so a decentralized exchange with a centralized exchange, and obviously the market cap of Coinbase has since fairly declined. Again, these are numbers at the end of 2021. But you can see here that it takes Coinbase more than 1,000 people to maintain their databases. Obviously, Coinbase until recently didn't have a blockchain. They just started offering a blockchain-based solution. Before that, they were more of the same, meaning they were a bank running databases that just happened to hold entries of standardized smart contracts, which we call tokens. And you can compare the revenues and the market cap here. And you can see that the decentralized software solution, so meaning the first fintech solution, is overall way more efficient in the usage of personnel and capital. And a similar comparison, again, apples to oranges to some extent, can be made using a legacy database company like Lending Club, again falsely claimed to be a fintech solution, which it's really not, having 1,000 employees and a decentralized software solution running a lending system on top of a blockchain like Aave, getting away with about 10% of the employees by originating more loans over a much shorter period of time. The most interesting example as of today to me are collateralized debt protocols. So as a refresher, and most people might actually not even know that, I touched on that earlier, the vast majority of currency in the current system is created by commercial banking activity, so specifically lending. And I personally actually don't refer to it as lending. If and when that happens, I just call it currency creation. So there's an entire space that we call today alternative lending. That is actually, from a legal perspective, the only form of lending, because commercial banks by and large create new currency when they lend. And as far as I'm concerned, you can't really lend what you didn't already possess or have. So that adds to the debasement of overall currency supply. So different here in our actual fintech scenario of a collateralized debt protocol, I might possess and have control over 50 Ether through my wallet, through my runner technically. And I might want to spend some US dollars, so I can approach a contract on MakerDAO, deposit my Ether into that contract. I have to over collateralize that and agree to a certain interest, and on the other end, MakerDAO will issue me a stable coin, in this particular case DAI, in a particular ratio, so 22,000 DAI, which is the same amount in dollars. So I can liquidate this amount of DAI on a centralized exchange against US dollar and spend it, and at some point in time go back to that contract, satisfy my loan, and retrieve my Ether. And indeed, there is also some, albeit small, activity through the commercial banking system that makes use of that particular decentralized software solution to issue loans. Then there are many, many, many unhelpful metaphors in the space of decentralized software solutions. Again, most popular term being used here is blockchains. Blockchains are not protocols. That is another conflation. Blockchains are indeed applications, and the most helpful metaphor I can offer is actually borrowed from Nick Szabo from a 1996 paper on asynchronous protocols, and that's that of a digital vending machine, hence the vending machine picture here. You can think of Bitcoin being a very simple vending machine, like a gumball machine with a turning mechanism that you put a quarter in and turn it and you can see what comes out, whereas Ether is a general vending machine that allows you to deposit many different things in many different forms and let you take it out to facilitate what we call peer-to-peer transactions. They are really not, because at the end you are interacting ultimately with an automaton in the middle. So on a very narrow technical view, there are not peer-to-peer transactions whenever you use a digital vending machines. And again, this comes back to the confusion to call blockchains protocols. They are not protocols, they are applications. And this dovetails into the next slide. Throughout the digitization space that I mentioned in the beginning of this talk, we spent 40 years digitizing contracts and ledger entries into bytes through companies like Xerox, Codex, IBM, and then we invented network solutions, and we spent another 20 years transferring data and messages using these network solutions by connecting databases to networks, which in hindsight was a rather big topology mistake that we are about to fix. And so for the next 10 years, unfortunately, we call things in other unhelpful ways like Web 1, Web 2, Web 3. Indeed, we never built the web in the first place. We are doing this experiment right now. Larger point there being is over the past 20 years, we have allowed systems like banking systems to call things payments, when in fact these were just messaging systems that would interact with other messengers in order to update ledgers under control of third parties. And that's the experiment that we're undergoing right now to fix that, and I will explain why this is important, meaningful, and ultimately inevitable. So the reason why this is somewhat opaque still is because we are very, very early. Less than 2% of the internet's population today operates a runner, often referred to as a wallet. Most of these users actually only hold some token or coin that they bought on a centralized exchange. So by and large, we are around 97 in terms of internet adoption, where the ability to enter into the internet was predicated by installing a dial-up modem and then waiting for 90 seconds for your Amazon page to load. And that's the state of blockchain-based solutions today. Why this will change is very different from what people claim to have identified today. It's mostly because of these 5 factors. Digitally native credentials, I explain why that is. Central bank digital currencies, stable coins, government mandates as countries demanding that specifically government functions have to be blockchain based in a specific period of time. And then lastly, and that's undervalued, cybersecurity. The reason why I say it's undervalued, because this is the industry as it stands today. The cybersecurity market is standing at around 150 billion around the time I assembled the first version of this presentation. And by and large, I call it security theater, meaning that you create all these layers around your database-driven solution, when in fact the most obvious and most used entry points is indeed the individual that has already credentials to these systems. 8 out of 10 times, that is how access is being gained to your data today. If cybersecurity and cybercrime was its own industry, its GDP would be larger than that of all but 2 countries. It stood at $6 trillion in 2021. As a frame of reference from our earlier slide, global GDP stood at $96 trillion during that same time. On current trajectory, cybercrime will reach $10 trillion by 2025. So it's not optional to move away from database solutions. Indeed, I predict that governments ultimately will decide to outlaw the use case of databases for particular use cases, i.e. storing value or storing personal identifiable data, which brings us to the next example. If you have an iPhone, you can pull up your native iPhone wallet. Apple provides its own wallet, and you can store concert tickets, airline tickets, and other things there, but you can also click on a little plus sign in the upper right hand corner, and you will discover that there is now 3 states, Arizona, Colorado, and Maryland, which will let you import your digital driver's license. This is a cryptographic primitive. It's stored on the enclave, and it talks to the TSA, it talks to local law enforcement in a very particular way, and that's why I put the check mark there, as in the law enforcement person, the person at the checkpoint, is usually not interested in your personal identifiable data. She is interested in receiving the green check mark, which is done today already using a particular ISO standard 18 or 13-54. There's 5 other states in the planning stages of implementing these. Another state, Louisiana, built their own wallet facilitating the same thing, but California, Connecticut, Georgia, Iowa, Kentucky, Oklahoma, and Utah are currently planning to adopt the same standard. So point there being is, and I simplify this for the sake of time because we are running up against the hour, if, when, where I can on a technical level attach personal identifiable data to any transaction, commercial or otherwise, only if there's a narrow legal requirement, i.e. a warrant, then doing what commercial banks and other financial institutions do today, which can be only described as wholesale warrantless surveillance, should simply be unlawful, and as far as I'm concerned, always has been an invasion of your Fourth Amendment rights if you're listening to this and you are a US citizen. Then another forcing function I mentioned is central bank digital currencies. The Federal Reserve System issued a not so helpful paper that we discussed for about 1,000 hours. You'll find an article on my profile that will take you more than half an hour to read that summarizes the state of the discussion around CBDCs, which by and large is discussing a straw man. The Fed decided that it was sufficient to put this definition of a CBDC being a digital liability of a central bank that's analogous to a digital form of paper money, which would be great, but a lot of people, including my friend Tom Emmer in the US Congress, doesn't believe these words, and in fact is being supported by facts stated in that paper that will actually indicate that there might be other reasons for that. However, I'm still hopeful, and indeed I would make the claim that there is a constitutional requirement on part of the government to provide us with property rights to these bytes. And if you read that article, it explains it in detail. So now I unfortunately have to rush through the last 3 minutes and give you the conclusion of the state of banking. The state of banking and financial services in general is basically that of massive markets, massive frictions, massive technology debt. Moving real estate today has about a 7% penalty attached to that, decreasing its velocity and attractiveness for stores of value and otherwise transactional activity. Bonds usually will incur a 1 to 5% penalty, equities 1 to 2%. And then there's the obvious large penalty if and when you're moving currency around, somewhere between 3 and 7%. And so in real terms, that means that you as a US household, you will spend 4% directly, and these are numbers that are actually being reported in this way by the Federal Reserve System, directly to banks. That's without doing anything. Then every transaction will carry on average about 6% added costs, so merchant account fees and others that you pay in the inflation of a product or service for using these legacy technology solutions. And then the currency in the United States has been debased year over year for decades by a minimum of 7%, but probably by actually more, which then ends up to be a $22.5 trillion penalty on the real economy globally. This is the revenue financial services made in 2021, and I simply call it a penalty on the real economy. The reason why I phrase it this way, and that's a term actually that the IMF supports as well, capital R, capital E. The economy is made up of the exchange of products and services, with financial solutions being a conduit. However, in the legacy system, they are allowed to extract about 22% from the real economy. With that, we're getting to the end. If you want to read more about our theories on the financial systems and related technologies, I publish on Forbes infrequently in digestible versions of 1,000 words. I teach a class at Harvard that will set you back, I think, about $3,000. I'll teach on CBDC specifically, and then my colleagues teach on other topics there. And then I'll publish long forms on Hacker Noons, and we are currently working on a larger treatise under the topic streaming money, which will come out in book form maybe later this year. With this, I'm ending my talk. Feel free to send me an email or message me on LinkedIn and let me know where you disagree. As always, this is all shared with the idea of peer review. I don't claim to have any particular wisdom other than that we looked at a few thousand projects and came up with some theories on how these projects might change commercial activity at scale over the next decade. Thank you very much if you made it to this point, and have a great rest of your day.